The last call lasted 19 minutes. Brandon talked the whole time. About the dark, about the ditch, about trying to find his car. He described the ground underfoot, the way the fields felt wet and uneven in the places where the spring runoff had pooled. He described lights in the distance. His father stayed on the line, asking questions, trying to pinpoint something, a road sign, a fence line, anything that could narrow a search radius. And then, mid-sentence, the line went silent. His father said hello, said it again. No answer, no background noise, no crackle of a dying signal, just nothing. That was May 14th, 2008, somewhere between 2:30 and 3 o'clock in the morning. Brandon Swanson was 19 years old. He was 6 feet tall, around 170 pounds, with sandy brown hair. He was wearing a gray t-shirt, jeans, and tennis shoes. He has not been seen since. To understand how a young man can vanish in the middle of a phone call in an open field in rural Minnesota with his father on the line, you have to go back to the beginning of that night. Not the disappearance, the decision. The ordinary, completely unremarkable decision that set everything in motion. Marshall, Minnesota. Population just under 13,000. It sits in Lyon County in the southwestern corner of the state, far from the Twin Cities, far from anywhere that typically makes national news. The landscape there is agricultural and flat, soybeans and corn, section roads laid out in clean grids, grain elevators visible from miles away on a clear day. In May, the fields are still low and dark with early growth. The soil is heavy with snowmelt, and the nights get genuinely black away from town. The kind of black where headlights feel like they're carving something out of the air rather than illuminating it. There are no foothills, no tree lines to orient by, just flat ground and sky, and the occasional cluster of lights from a small town sitting miles off on the horizon, like a ship on water. Brandon Swanson grew up in Marshall. He knew that landscape. He had driven those section roads, those gravel county routes, with their sharp shoulder drop-offs and their unmarked intersections, many times. He was 19, finishing his freshman year at Southwest Minnesota State University, which sits right there in Marshall, a campus of about 7,000 students in a town that shapes itself around the rhythms of agriculture and the academic calendar. Brandon worked. He had a solid group of friends, by every account from family, classmates, and the people who would later spend years searching for him. He was reliable, not reckless, not someone with a history of disappearing or causing alarm. His parents, Brian and Annette Swanson, knew their son. They were the kind of family that stayed in contact, that called each other back, that operated with the quiet expectation that if something went wrong, the other would pick up the phone. That detail matters more than almost anything else in this story. Remember it. On the night of May 13th, 2008, sliding into the early hours of May 14th, Brandon attended a party near the small town of Canby, about 30 miles northeast of Marshall. Canby has fewer than 2,000 residents. The nearest hospital is in Marshall. The nearest interstate is well to the north. It exists in that specific category of small American towns that are primarily known to the people who live within 20 miles of them. The party was the kind of thing common to rural college towns in May. End of semester, warm enough finally to be outside after a long winter, set on land with enough distance from neighbors that volume wasn't a concern. Brandon was there with friends. He had been drinking. That is part of the record, part of what any honest account of this night includes. At some point in the early morning hours, the party wound down and Brandon got in his car to make the 30-mile drive back to Marshall. He didn't make it far. Somewhere on those flat, grid-section roads, somewhere in that dark, familiar landscape, Brandon's car went into a ditch. Not violently. The car, a green 2001 Pontiac Grand Am, wasn't wrecked in any meaningful sense. No airbags deployed. No structural damage that made it undrivable in the long term. It was simply stuck. Stuck the way vehicles get stuck on rural Minnesota roads in May, when the shoulder has been softened by weeks of rain and snow melt, and drops off 2 feet without warning. You drift a foot too far right in the dark, the tire catches the soft edge, and the car slides down at an angle that makes it impossible to back out without a tow. Brandon wasn't injured. He sat in the car for a few minutes, assessed the situation, and called his parents. This is where the timeline becomes a document. Brian and Annette Swanson received their son's call just before 1 a.m. Brandon told them what had happened. Car in the ditch, somewhere between Canby and Marshall. He wasn't entirely certain of his exact location. He had been on county roads, the kind that all look similar in the dark. He said he'd been trying to figure out where he was. Brian and Annette told him to stay put. They got in their car, it was approaching 1 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, and drove out toward Canby, toward where they reasoned he must be based on the route he would have taken home. They drove east out of Marshall on State Highway 68, then onto the county roads, trying to cover the corridor between Marshall and Canby in a methodical way while staying on the phone with their son. They searched for over 2 hours. Brandon did not stay entirely put. He walked. He said he could see lights in the distance, what he thought were the lights of Lynn, a small town of roughly 350 people that sits along U.S. Highway 75 between Marshall and Canby. The lights made sense as a landmark. Lynn was the logical intermediate stop on the route he would have driven. He started walking toward them. Brian and Annette drove those roads, 63rd Avenue, sections of County Road 10, the approaches to Lynn from the east, calling his name out the window at various points, slowing at driveways and intersections, trying to close the gap between the description Brandon was giving and the geography they were covering in the dark. They could not find him. At approximately 2:30 a.m., after more than 90 minutes of searching with no success, Brian Swanson called his son again. Brandon answered. This was the call, the one that would last 19 minutes and end with a sound that nobody has satisfactorily explained in the 16 years since. Brandon described walking through a field. Low ground, wet in places, uneven. He was still oriented toward those lights. He was tired. The night had been long, and the walking was slow in the dark. Brian stayed on the line and kept working to orient his son, kept asking him to describe what he could see, what direction he was walking, whether he could identify any road signs or structures. Annette was in the car alongside Brian. They were both listening. And then, 19 minutes into the call, Brandon said something, a single word, short and sharp, and the line cut. Not a gradual fade, not a signal dying crackle, a cut. Brian said hello. Annette said hello. They called back immediately. Voicemail. They called again. Voicemail. They called a third time, a fourth time, standing in that car on a dark county road in Lyon County with the fields flat and black around them on every side. Each time, voicemail. The phone went to voicemail, and it stayed there. Brian and Annette Swanson did not go home. They stayed out on those roads through the rest of the night. They drove every route they could construct in their heads, every variant of the path between where the car might have gone into the ditch and where Lynn sat with its small cluster of lights. They covered ground at walking speed in places, headlights sweeping the ditch lines. Dawn came up over the flat southwest Minnesota landscape, pale gray first, then the slow orange specific to that wide, open sky. And they were still out there. When the light was good enough to confirm what the dark had already told them, they contacted law enforcement. This is where the investigation begins, and where one of the most consequential early decisions in this case was made. When Brian and Annette reported Brandon missing to local law enforcement in the hours following that lost phone call, they encountered a policy that was standard in Minnesota at the time. Adults had to be missing for at least 24 hours before an official search could be formally initiated. The logic behind such policies is understandable in the abstract. Most missing adults are not missing in any dangerous sense. They left voluntarily. They're at a friend's place. They'll surface in a day or two, slightly embarrassed. The policy exists to prevent the significant mobilization of resources for situations that resolve on their own, as the majority of them do. But Brandon's situation did not fit that template in any meaningful way. Brandon had been in the middle of a phone call with his father when contact was cut. He had a vehicle in a ditch. He was on foot, alone, in rural fields in the dark. His phone was going to voicemail. His parents had been actively searching for him for hours and could not find him. The urgency was not theoretical. It was documented in real time in a call log with timestamps. This was not a case of a young man who had wandered off voluntarily and hadn't checked in. This was a case of active, ongoing contact that stopped without explanation. The 24-hour window did not technically apply in the way it might to an ordinary missing persons report. But in practice, the large-scale coordinated search with full law enforcement resources did not deploy immediately. Hours passed, hours in the early morning of May 14th, when the ground still held whatever trace Brandon's passage had left in it. Hours when a scent trail was its freshest. Hours before other foot traffic, other vehicles, the activities of a normal rural morning began to overwrite whatever the fields near Lynn could have told searchers. When the search did begin in full, it was significant by any measure. Hundreds of volunteers turned out over the course of the first days. Law enforcement from Lyon County and neighboring agencies coordinated. Search and rescue teams came in from the region. K-9 units worked the fields east and southeast of Lynn. Helicopters swept the area from above. Brandon's car was located relatively quickly. The green Pontiac Grand Am, sitting in the ditch along 63rd Avenue, a gravel section road approximately 1 mile east of Lynn. That location was important for several reasons. 1 mile east of Lynn, which meant that when Brandon had described the lights in the distance, he had been right. He had correctly identified his approximate position. He was not lost in a way that placed him miles from where he thought he was. He was close, within walking distance of a town, within sight, in the dark, of actual lights. The car was there. Brandon was not. Searchers combed the fields radiating out from that location. They walked the ditch lines of every section road in the area. They searched the surrounding farmland in grids. The Yellow Medicine River runs through that part of Lyon County, and several tributaries and drainage channels cross the land between 63rd Avenue and the main channel. In May of 2008, Those waterways were running higher than normal. The winter had been heavy, and the spring runoff was still working through the system. Water levels in drainage channels and low-lying areas throughout that part of southwestern Minnesota were elevated. Some areas that were normally passable on foot were running fast and deep with cold snow melt. Searchers checked every one of those waterways they could access. K-9 teams tracked scent through the fields. In certain areas, the dogs followed a trail that moved in a specific direction, toward the Yellow Medicine River drainage corridor. And then the trail stopped. Precisely what that means, investigators have debated for 16 years. Dogs lose scent at water. That is a known, documented phenomenon. What it implies about what happened to a person who was being tracked is one of those questions that evidence alone can answer, and the evidence here was incomplete. Nothing was found. The days after a disappearance carry a particular texture. The phone calls that come in constantly, the community mobilizing, while the family stands at the center of it all, simultaneously grateful and underwater. Brian and Annette Swanson lived every dimension of that. They did not retreat into it. They pushed. They demanded answers. They stayed public about the case in a way that would matter enormously in the years ahead. Annette spoke at vigils. Brian gave interviews. They kept Brandon's name in circulation, not as a passive hope, but as an active insistence. Their son was out there. The answer existed somewhere, and someone needed to keep looking. Investigators turned their attention to the phone call itself. 19 minutes is a significant amount of time, and the call contained navigational information, descriptions of terrain, descriptions of direction. But the exact sound Brandon made in the final second before the line cut became a subject of quiet, careful disagreement. Some who heard the recording described it as a startled expletive. Others were less certain. What no one disputed was the character of the ending. There was no trailing off, no gradual signal loss, no, "Dad, I think I see," followed by a fade. It was present, and then it was not. The abruptness was total. Theories emerged almost immediately, as they always do in cases like this. The most prominent was accidental. He fell, struck his head, ended up in one of the many drainage features that cross that part of Lyon County. The terrain there is not dramatic in the way of mountains or ravines, but it is riddled with agricultural drainage infrastructure, culverts running under roads, open drainage channels 6 and 8 feet deep, low spots that fill with spring runoff and sit cold and deep well into May. If Brandon had been walking fast, disoriented by fatigue and by the dark, and had stumbled into a deep channel or been carried by a current in the Yellow Medicine system, the outcome is not difficult to imagine. What is difficult is the recovery. Rivers carry, drainage systems carry, and the body of water that may have received whatever happened to Brandon Swanson in the early hours of May 14th, 2008 is a system that extends well beyond the immediate search area. A second theory involved foul play. Someone in a vehicle on those dark rural roads in the early morning hours. A stranger, or someone who wasn't a stranger. This theory was pursued. Investigators interviewed everyone at the party, everyone who had been seen on those roads that night, everyone whose name or vehicle came up in any context. Publicly, at least, no credible suspect emerged. No physical evidence at the scene pointed to an encounter with another person. The car showed no signs of a struggle. No witnesses placed an unknown vehicle near Brandon's location at the relevant time. The third theory, the one the family rejected most firmly and most consistently, was voluntary disappearance. The idea that Brandon had chosen to vanish, to walk away from his life without explanation. This theory found almost no support among anyone who knew him. He was on the phone with his father, trying to be found. He was walking toward lights to signal his location. He had a life he was engaged with, school, work, friends, a family that was, by every account, close and functional. Nothing in his history pointed toward a young man who wanted to disappear. The Swansons made this clear in every public statement they gave, for years, firmly and without hesitation. No evidence ever supported the voluntary theory, and no evidence ever definitively resolved the accident theory or the foul play theory. The car sat in the ditch. The phone went to voicemail. The dogs tracked to the water and stopped. Months passed, then a year. Brian and Annette Swanson were not the kind of parents who waited in silence. In 2009, less than 12 months after Brandon vanished, they traveled to the Minnesota State Legislature and testified. They sat in front of lawmakers and described, calmly and in specific detail, the 24-hour wait policy, the hours that had passed before a full search was deployed, and what different resources mobilized earlier might have meant for their son's case. They were not emotional in a performative way. They were specific. They cited dates and times. They described the timeline they had lived through and asked legislators to consider what that timeline would have looked like under different policies. On May 27, 2009, 13 days after the one-year anniversary of Brandon's disappearance, Governor Tim Pawlenty signed the legislation that became known formally as Brandon's Law. The statute amended Minnesota law to require that law enforcement agencies accept and act upon reports of missing persons immediately, regardless of elapsed time. No more 24-hour threshold. No more administrative delay before a search could begin. A missing person reported in Minnesota would, from that point forward, trigger an immediate response from law enforcement. The officer receiving the report would be required to act. It is one of the few cases in this genre where a family's advocacy produced a concrete legal change while the case at the center of that advocacy remained unsolved. Brandon Swanson's name is now embedded in Minnesota statute. It has governed how law enforcement handles missing persons reports in that state for 15 years. Every case since 2009 in which a missing person was found, because law enforcement moved faster than they would have under the old policy, carries some connection, however uncountable, to a 19-year-old who went to a party in Canby and never made it home. The law was real. The grief was also real. The case stayed open. The Lyon County Sheriff's Office never formally closed the file. That deserves to be stated plainly, because cold cases have a way of becoming administrative objects, officially open on paper, practically shelved, waiting for a deathbed confession or a construction crew to turn up something unexpected. Brandon's case didn't calcify entirely in that way. Periodically, the area around Lind and along the Yellow Medicine River was searched again with updated technology and updated protocols. Ground-penetrating radar. Aerial imaging with better resolution than 2008 equipment could produce. More sophisticated water search protocols that accounted for current patterns and seasonal variation in the river system. One figure who became associated with the ongoing search effort was Tim Miller, the founder of Texas EquiSearch, a volunteer search organization that has worked missing persons cases across the country over several decades. Miller had run searches in Louisiana, in Texas, in Florida, cases that attracted national attention, cases in which other organizations had long since packed up. He brought his team to Lyon County more than once. He spoke publicly and specifically about the geography east of Lynn, about the drainage corridor, about the conviction shared by many involved in the search that the answer to Brandon's disappearance was somewhere in that river system or the land immediately adjacent to it. The searches produced no confirmed remains. In 2012, 4 years after Brandon vanished, skeletal remains were discovered in the area. The discovery moved through the community and through the family with the particular weight that such findings carry. A weight compounded by years of not knowing, years of hoping and dreading simultaneously. Investigators worked the identification carefully and methodically. The remains were ultimately identified as belonging to someone else entirely. An unrelated case. An unrelated tragedy that had been waiting in that same southwestern Minnesota landscape, unnoticed for its own reasons. The Swansons received that news and absorbed it. They continued. By 2016, the case was 8 years old. The fields east of Lynn had been walked repeatedly. The Yellow Medicine River had been examined at multiple access points in multiple seasons. The phone records had been analyzed. The party attendees had been interviewed, some more than once. Law enforcement had followed every lead that emerged in 8 years of a public, well-documented, actively maintained missing persons case, and the case remained at exactly the same position it had occupied in the first week. A car in a ditch, a phone call that ended, and a 22-second window between the last confirmed sound of Brandon's voice and everything that came after. Brandon's parents were still talking about him publicly in 2016, still giving interviews when asked, still appearing at events for missing persons awareness and cold case advocacy. Brandon Swanson had become a recognizable figure in conversations about missing persons law and policy in Minnesota, not because he sought that prominence, but because he had done the work that earned it, the legislative testimony, the continued engagement with investigators, the public persistence. He spoke about Brandon's law and its ongoing application. He spoke, when asked directly, about the years, about what it costs to live in the middle of an unanswered question. One of the investigative questions that persisted across all those years involved the phone call geography. 19 minutes is a long time to walk, and Brandon had been walking for some portion of the time before that final call as well. If his car was on 63rd Avenue, approximately 1 mile east of Lynn, and he was walking west toward the lights of Lynn, the most direct route across that terrain would have taken him through farmland and toward the Yellow Medicine River drainage corridor. The distance from the car's location to the river is roughly measurable, not great in straight-line terms for someone walking at a moderate pace across open ground, on foot in the dark in May, across fields that were soft and wet from weeks of elevated water levels. That walk could be covered in somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes, depending on conditions. Brandon had been walking for a significant portion of those 2+ hours before the final call began. By the time that call started, he may have been considerably closer to the river than his starting point suggested. The math was always troubling. Close enough that the river theory never lost its weight. Far enough that nothing could be confirmed. In 2019, 11 years after Brandon disappeared, the case received renewed national attention. True crime podcasts featured it. Long-form journalism pieces examined it in the context of larger conversations about missing persons in rural America, about how cases involving young men in particular often receive less sustained attention than cases involving young women, about how rural disappearances without dramatic crime scenes can slip through the cracks of media attention and investigative resources. The Swanson family engaged with that coverage carefully. Brian and Annette gave interviews that were measured, specific, and clearly the product of years of living inside this case, with full knowledge of every detail. They did not sensationalize. They described their son. They described the night. They pushed again for anyone with information to come forward. None of it broke the case open. There is a specific quality to cases that persist across a decade and more without resolution. The acute phase, the searches, the press conferences, the missing flyers stapled to telephone poles on every county road in Lyon County, gives way to something slower and harder to name. The infrastructure of public attention moves on, because it has to, because other disappearances happen, other families need that infrastructure. What doesn't move on is the family at the center. Brian and Annette Swanson entered a category that exists with uncomfortable specificity in American life. Parents of a child who is neither confirmed dead nor confirmed alive. The legal mechanism of presumed dead carries its own bureaucratic and emotional weight. Families often resist it for years, sometimes indefinitely. It requires saying something out loud that every instinct refuses to ratify. It requires treating the absence as a conclusion rather than an interruption. The Swansons, as of the most recent public information available, have continued to treat Brandon as a missing person. The case has not produced evidence of his death. It has also not produced evidence of his continued life. That space in between is where they live. In 2022, 14 years after Brandon walked away from his car on 63rd Avenue, law enforcement conducted additional searches in the area east of Lind and along the Yellow Medicine River corridor. The technology available had improved substantially since 2008. Sonar equipment capable of detailed imaging of river channels, aerial platforms with thermal and multispectral imaging, updated search protocols that incorporated everything learned from more than a decade of periodic investigation. The searches were methodical. They were reported on locally and picked up by outlets that cover cold cases at a national level. Families of missing persons across the country watched, as they often do when a case like this gets renewed attention, with the particular attention of people who understand exactly what the Swansons were waiting to hear. The searches did not produce Brandon Swanson. As of the most recent public reporting on this case, Brandon Swanson remains listed as a missing person. He would be 35 years old. The Lyon County Sheriff's Office has not closed the file. His case remains active in the sense that law enforcement will pursue credible new information if it emerges, and the Swanson family has not stopped being public about the case or about the need for anyone who knows anything to come forward. The green Pontiac Grand Am was recovered from the ditch on 63rd Avenue and returned to the family. The phone records of that final 19-minute call are part of the permanent case documentation. The exact sound, that sharp, brief, startled word before the line cut, is still part of what investigators have, and still part of what they have never been able to fully interpret. It could mean many things. It has never conclusively meant any of them. Brandon's law remains on the books in Minnesota. If you go missing in that state today, Law enforcement cannot tell your family to come back in 24 hours. That law exists because two parents took their grief and their specific, technical, factual knowledge of what had failed in their son's case and turned it into testimony and then into statute. It has shaped how law enforcement in Minnesota responds to missing persons reports every year since 2009. The number of cases in which that faster response made the critical difference is impossible to calculate cleanly. Causation in those situations doesn't produce tidy statistics, but the law is there. It is active. It carries the name of a 19-year-old who went to a party on a Tuesday night in rural Minnesota and never came home. The last confirmed location for Brandon Swanson is a point along 63rd Avenue, Lyon County, Minnesota. A gravel road with soft shoulders and section fields, running flat to every horizon. A green car sitting at an angle in a ditch. A flat, dark landscape with the lights of a small town, visible a mile to the west. He walked toward those lights. 19 minutes later, mid-sentence, the call ended. No one has explained what happened in the seconds after that. Some cases close with a verdict read in a courtroom. Some close with a phone call to a family saying what they already knew. Some close when someone, finally, after years of living with the weight of it, tells the truth. And some remain open, held together by the persistence of families who refuse to allow an unanswered question to become an accepted condition. Brandon Swanson's case is one of those. It has produced legislation that protects people across an entire state. It has generated searches that stretched across 16 years. It has brought hundreds of volunteers into cold fields in Lyon County. It has produced national coverage, podcast episodes, long-form reporting, and sustained advocacy from two parents who have never stopped being Brandon Swanson's parents, regardless of what the calendar said. The answer may be somewhere in the Yellow Medicine River drainage system, in soil and sediment that has absorbed 16 Minnesota winters since that May morning. It may be somewhere else entirely. What is certain is that the question is still open, and that the people who need it answered have never stopped asking. If this case is the kind that stays with you, and cases without resolution have a specific way of doing that, of sitting in the back of the mind long after the screen goes dark, there is another one waiting on this channel. A disappearance that took investigators nearly as long to understand, in a landscape just as ordinary as a Minnesota county road at night, where the answers were present the entire time and buried in plain sight, until someone looked at exactly the right detail, from exactly the right angle. It's there when you're ready. Brandon Swanson, 19 years old. Last heard on May 14th, 2008, 19 minutes into a phone call with his father, somewhere in the dark near Lynn, Minnesota. Still missing.